The neon sign flickered outside the highway diner, casting its garish glow across the deserted parking lot. Judy's Eats had seen better days, but it was the only place open for miles. Traveling salesman Greg Sutton pulled into the lot, his stomach growling louder than the static-filled talk radio he'd been listening to for the last 100 miles. As he stepped inside, a bell above the door jingled faintly, the sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the room. The diner looked like a time capsule from the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and grease. Behind the counter stood a waitress, her back turned as she wiped down the grill. She was the only other person there. Greg cleared his throat. "Evening. You still serving?" The waitress turned, her expression unreadable. Her uniform, crisp and pristine, seemed out of place in the shabby surroundings. "Of course," she said, her voice flat. "Take a seat anywhere." Greg slid into a booth by the window, noticing how the glass was so smeared he couldn't see his car outside. He picked up the sticky menu, the pages curling at the edges. The options were basic: burgers, fries, a few breakfast items. When the waitress approached, pen poised over a notepad, he ordered a cheeseburger and black coffee. "Coming right up," she said, her eyes lingering on him a beat too long. As she retreated to the kitchen, Greg scanned the room. There were no other customers, no sounds from the jukebox or the kitchen radio. The silence pressed in on him, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. His eyes landed on a framed photograph behind the counter. A group of people, presumably the diner staff, grinning for the camera. But something about their smiles made his skin crawl. They were too wide, too forced, their eyes uncomfortably focused on the lens. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting the mug down without a word. Greg noticed her hands were pale and bone-thin, almost skeletal. He took a sip, grimacing as the acrid liquid burned his tongue. It tasted off, metallic, like the water had been pulled from rusty pipes. "You're not from around here," the waitress said, her voice startling in the silence. She didn't phrase it like a question. "Just passing through," Greg replied, trying to sound casual. She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "We don't get many visitors anymore. Used to, though. This place was always packed." Greg forced a smile. "Times change, I guess." The waitress didn't respond. She turned and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Greg with his uneasy thoughts. He fidgeted with the silverware, noticing how tarnished the knife and fork were. The whole place felt wrong, like it existed in a bubble outside of reality. When the food arrived, it didn't look much better than the coffee. The burger patty was grayish, the cheese a waxy sheen of orange. But Greg was too hungry to care. He took a bite, and though the taste was bland, he forced it down. The fries were soggy, limp, and tasted faintly of old grease. As he ate, the unease in his chest grew. The windows reflected the diner's interior, but the longer he stared, the more it seemed like the reflections weren't quite right. The angles were off, the movements delayed by a fraction of a second. When he glanced at the counter, he swore he saw one of the people in the photograph move. "Everything okay?" The waitress was suddenly standing beside him, her eyes boring into his. Greg nearly jumped out of his seat. "Yeah, fine. Just tired, I guess." Her lips twitched into a semblance of a smile. "Long drive?" "Yeah, long drive." Her smile widened. "You'll want to rest up before you head out. We've got a room in the back. No charge." Greg hesitated. Something about her tone sent a shiver down his spine. "No, thanks. I'll be hitting the road as soon as I'm done." The waitress tilted her head, her smile faltering. "Suit yourself. But the roads can be dangerous at night." Greg nodded, hoping the conversation was over. He focused on finishing his meal, though every bite seemed to stick in his throat. When he finally pushed the plate away, he realized he hadn't seen the waitress return to the kitchen. She was just gone. The oppressive silence had deepened, the air thick with an unplaceable tension. Greg decided it was time to leave. He fished a 20 from his wallet and set it on the table, then headed for the door. But as he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. He yanked harder, but it was like the door was welded shut. "Going somewhere?" The waitress's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her standing by the counter, her expression blank. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were darker now, the whites almost entirely swallowed by her pupils. "I paid. The door's stuck," Greg said, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay calm. She took a step closer, her movements unnaturally stiff. "You can't leave." Greg's heart began to race. "What do you mean? Open the door." The waitress didn't respond. Instead, she smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. You don't understand, do you? No one ever leaves. The lights in the diner flickered violently, and for a brief moment, Greg saw something impossible. The walls were no longer walls, but pulsating, fleshy masses. The booths twisted into grotesque shapes, and the faces in the photograph now stared directly at him, their eyes wide with hunger. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What is this place? The waitress's voice distorted, layered with something guttural and inhuman. You're home now. Greg turned and slammed his shoulder into the door, desperate to escape. It gave way suddenly, and he tumbled into the parking lot. Scrambling to his feet, he bolted for his car, his keys already in his hand. He didn't dare look back. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the lot, tires screeching. As he sped down the dark highway, he risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The diner was gone. The lot was empty, no neon sign, no building, just an expanse of cracked asphalt under the cold moonlight. But the relief was short-lived. From the passenger seat came a whisper, faint but unmistakable. You'll be back. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the windshield of Brian's pickup truck as he drove along the desolate country road. He squinted into the darkness, the wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. The diner's glowing sign appeared suddenly in the distance. Mom's Place. Open 24 hours. It was the only light he'd seen for miles, and his stomach growled at the thought of a hot meal. The parking lot was empty, save for a single rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Brian killed the engine and jogged through the rain to the front door, the bell above it jingling faintly as he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. It was old-fashioned, too old-fashioned, like a relic from another time. Take a seat wherever, called a deep voice from behind the counter. Brian glanced up to see a man standing there. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculately pressed. His face, though, was wrong, too symmetrical, his smile stretched unnaturally wide. Brian swallowed hard, chalking up the unease to his exhaustion, and slid into a booth by the window. "What can I get ya?" the man asked, walking over with a pad and pen. His movements were mechanical, deliberate. "Just a burger and coffee," Brian said, his voice sounding small in the stillness. The man nodded and disappeared into the kitchen without another word. Brian shivered slightly, though the diner wasn't cold. Something about the place felt off. The rain hammered against the window, and he noticed how the glass warped the view of the parking lot. The single car outside seemed to ripple and shift, as though it wasn't really there. The clatter of dishes startled him. He turned to see the man setting a steaming mug of coffee on the table. The burger followed a minute later. It smelled fine, but Brian couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced around. The diner was empty, yet he felt eyes on him. As he bit into the burger, the texture was off, gritty, almost sandy. He spat it out, coughing. "Hey, what's in this?" he called toward the counter. The man didn't answer. He stood perfectly still, staring at Brian with that same unsettling smile. Brian's stomach churned as he looked closer at the burger. The patty glistened oddly in the dim light, tiny fibers poking out of the meat. Human hair. Brian recoiled, his chair screeching against the floor. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the diner. The man tilted his head slightly. "It's what you ordered." Brian stood, his heart pounding, and backed toward the door. "I'm leaving." The man's smile widened impossibly. "No one leaves." The lights flickered, and suddenly the diner was alive. The walls pulsed and oozed, like the checkerboard floor rippling like water. Brian turned to bolt for the door, but it was gone. In its place was a wall of flesh, veins throbbing beneath its surface. "What the?" Brian's voice caught in his throat as he turned back toward the man, who was no longer a man at all. His features melted like wax, revealing a featureless, pale form with hollow, black pits where eyes should have been. Its mouth opened, splitting its face in two as it let out a soundless scream. Brian stumbled backward, tripping over the booth and crashing to the floor. Hands, no, claws, erupted from the walls, reaching for him, their bony fingers dripping with viscous fluid. He scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged, and grabbed a chair, swinging it wildly. The claws recoiled, but the walls began to close in, the diner shrinking with every passing second. "You wanted a meal," the thing hissed, its voice like nails on glass. "Now you're part of one." Brian's vision blurred as the air grew thick with a sickly, sweet stench. He clawed at the wall, desperate to find an exit, but his hands sank into the fleshy surface. It was warm, alive, and it pulsed beneath his fingers. A scream tore from his throat as he felt something grip his ankles, dragging him backward. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was the diner's flickering sign outside the window, now reading, "Closed forever." The diner sat at the edge of the forest, a relic of a bygone era. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, the word "eats" flickering like a dying ember in the oppressive night. Natalie pulled into the gravel lot, her small sedan the only car in sight. Her phone had died hours ago, and with it, her GPS. She hadn't seen another soul on the winding back roads, and her stomach twisted in hunger and unease. She hesitated before stepping inside, the door creaking loudly as if warning her not to enter. The diner was eerily quiet. A faint smell of grease and mildew lingered in the air, and the decor was decades out of date. There were no customers, just a man behind the counter. His back was turned, but he straightened when he heard the door close. "Welcome," he said, turning slowly to face her. His voice was deep and scratchy, like it hadn't been used in years. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long, and his smile didn't reach them. "Take a seat anywhere." Natalie chose a booth near the window, though the glass was so fogged and smudged she could barely see outside. She glanced at the menu, its laminated surface sticky to the touch, and decided on a grilled cheese and coffee. The man brought her drink first, setting the mug down with a dull thunk. The coffee was almost black, its surface oily and unappealing. She sipped it cautiously and gagged. It tasted metallic like blood. She pushed it aside and decided to wait for her food. As she sat, the silence became oppressive. There was no music, no hum of a refrigerator, not even the clink of dishes. Her eyes wandered to the counter where an old photo hung in a tarnished frame. It showed a group of smiling people, presumably the staff. But something was off. Their faces were blurred, the smiles too wide, their eyes faintly glowing in the dim light. "Here you go." The man's voice made her jump. He set the plate in front of her, the grilled cheese glistening with an unsettling sheen. Natalie forced a smile and picked up the sandwich, biting into it reluctantly. The taste was wrong. It wasn't cheese, and the bread was soft and spongy in a way that made her stomach churn. She set it down, wiping her mouth, and looked up to see the man watching her from the counter. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. "Not hungry?" he asked. "Just tired," Natalie replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I pay now?" The man didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. Natalie reached for her wallet and placed a 20 on the table, sliding out of the booth. She tried to act calm, but her legs felt like lead as she headed for the door. When she pushed it open, she was greeted by a blast of icy wind. She stepped outside and froze. Her car was gone. The gravel lot stretched endlessly into the night, the forest looming on all sides. The diner's neon sign flickered violently, casting the trees in grotesque, shifting shadows. Panic bubbled in her chest as she turned to go back inside, but the door wouldn't budge. Behind her, the sign went dark. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. It was as if the world had been muted. Then she saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the blackness, watching her from the tree line. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. Natalie stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You shouldn't have come here," the man's voice said, though it no longer sounded human. It came from all around her, echoing in the stillness. She turned back to the diner, only to find that it too had changed. The walls seemed to pulse, the windows now dark voids that swallowed the light. The door opened slowly, and the man stepped out, though he was no longer a man. His face had stretched grotesquely, his jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged teeth. His hands were too long, the fingers tipped with claws that scraped against the door frame. Natalie screamed and ran, her feet slipping on the loose gravel. She sprinted toward the forest, desperate to escape, but the eyes moved closer, surrounding her. A sickening smell filled the air, and a low growl rumbled through the trees. She turned to see the man, or the thing that had been the man, stalking toward her, its limbs contorting unnaturally as it moved. "You can't leave," it hissed, its voice like nails on glass. "No one ever leaves." The ground beneath her shifted, the gravel giving way to something soft and wet. She looked down to see that she was standing in a pool of dark, viscous liquid. It clung to her shoes, pulling her down as she struggled to move. The glowing eyes closed in, and Natalie's screams echoed into the night, swallowed by the darkness. The diner's sign flickered back on, its neon glow bathing the empty lot in an eerie light. "Eats," it buzzed faintly, as if mocking her. And then, silence. The highway stretched endlessly before him, the diner's glowing sign a small beacon in the surrounding blackness. Jake had been driving for hours, his eyelids heavy and his gas tank nearly empty. The sign read, "Rusty's Diner, open all night." It seemed like a godsend. He parked his car and stepped into the still, humid air. The diner was old, its once bright paint peeling, the windows streaked with grime, but it was the only sign of life he'd seen in miles, so he pushed open the door. The bell jingled overhead, and the scent of burnt coffee and grease hit him like a wave. Inside, the diner was dimly lit and eerily quiet. A lone man sat hunched in a booth near the back, his face hidden beneath a dirty cap. Behind the counter stood a woman, her uniform crisp but outdated, her expression flat. "Take a seat," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. Jake slid into a booth near the window, though the glass was so dirty it might as well have been painted black. The woman brought him a laminated menu without a word. He glanced at it, his stomach turning at the faded pictures of food. He settled on a simple order, pancakes and coffee. The woman nodded and walked away. Her footsteps didn't echo. In fact, they made no sound at all. Jake frowned but brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. As he waited, he glanced around. The man in the back booth hadn't moved. Jake squinted and realized the man wasn't eating or drinking. He was just sitting there, perfectly still. Unease crept up Jake's spine. The woman returned, setting down a mug of coffee. It was black as tar, the steam curling unnaturally, like tendrils reaching for the ceiling. Jake took a cautious sip and gagged. It was bitter and metallic, tasting nothing like coffee. "You okay?" the woman asked, her expression unchanged. "Yeah, fine," Jake muttered, setting the mug aside. Minutes ticked by, the silence in the diner becoming oppressive. The man in the back booth shifted slightly, his cap tilting just enough for Jake to catch a glimpse of his face. Or rather, the absence of it. Where the man's features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. Jake's breath hitched. He blinked, hoping his eyes were deceiving him, but when he looked again, the booth was empty. The man was gone. "What the hell?" Jake whispered. "Your food's ready," the woman said, startling him. She placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. The stack was perfectly golden, but the syrup glistened unnaturally and the smell was sickly sweet. Jake picked up his fork and hesitated. Something about the food felt wrong, like it was too perfect, too artificial. He took a bite, and his teeth crunched down on something hard. He spat it out and looked at the remnants on his plate. Sticking out of the syrup was a jagged shard of bone. His stomach churned as he shoved the plate away. "I'm not eating this," he said, standing up. The woman didn't respond. She just stared at him, her head tilting ever so slightly. Jake backed toward the door, his heart pounding. As he reached for the handle, the room plunged into darkness. "Leaving so soon?" A voice whispered, though it didn't come from the woman. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake turned, his eyes struggling to adjust. The diner had transformed. The walls were no longer walls, but slick, pulsating flesh. The booths melted into grotesque shapes, their surfaces oozing a dark, tar-like substance. The woman was gone, and in her place stood something tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its mouth stretching wide in a grin that split its face in half. Jake bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting outside. The air was thick, suffocating, and the parking lot was unrecognizable. His car was gone, replaced by rows of gravestones jutting out of the cracked asphalt. Each one bore a name, and as he ran past them, he saw his own. "No," he gasped, stumbling to his knees. The diner loomed behind him, its glowing sign flickering violently. "Rusty's Diner," it read, though the letters, twisted and warped, forming a new message. No escape. Jake's scream was swallowed by the night as the shadows closed in, dragging him back toward the diner. The sign buzzed faintly, its light casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. Somewhere in the distance, the bell jingled again, announcing the arrival of another lost traveler. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the narrow highway into a slick black river. Amy gripped the steering wheel tightly, squinting through the windshield as her wipers struggled to keep up. The green glow of her fuel gauge warned that she was dangerously close to empty. Relief washed over her when a sign emerged from the storm. Maggie's Diner, open 24/7. Next exit. She took the exit, following a winding road until the diner's faint neon lights appeared in the distance. It stood alone in the desolate landscape, its parking lot a muddy mess. Amy parked and dashed inside, her jacket doing little to shield her from the cold, biting rain. The door jingled as she entered, and the smell of fried food and stale coffee enveloped her. The diner was almost too quiet, save for the low hum of a jukebox playing an old, scratchy tune. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her smile a little too wide, her eyes glassy. "Welcome to Maggie's," the waitress said. "Take a seat anywhere." Amy chose a booth by the window, though the outside world was a blur of rain and darkness. The waitress brought her a menu, the laminated edges curling with age. Amy ordered a grilled cheese and tomato soup, grateful for something warm. As she waited, she noticed the other patrons, or rather, the lack thereof. There were 3 others in the diner, each seated at separate tables. None of them spoke or ate. They just stared down at their plates, unmoving. Amy shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the nearest one. A man in a rumpled suit with deep bags under his eyes. His food sat untouched, his hands resting limply in his lap. She looked awakely, focusing on the jukebox, which was now skipping on the same melancholic note over and over. "Here you go," the waitress said, startling her. She placed the food down with a mechanical precision, her unblinking gaze fixed on Amy. "Thanks," Amy muttered, forcing a polite smile. The grilled cheese was greasy, the soup lukewarm, but hunger compelled her to eat. As she dipped the sandwich into the soup, she noticed something odd, a dark, oily sheen on the surface. She hesitated, but hunger won out, and she took a bite. The taste was metallic, almost coppery, and she gagged, pushing the plate away. Her stomach churned as she reached for her water, but the glass was sticky, as though it hadn't been washed in weeks. "Not to your liking?" the waitress asked, suddenly at her side. "I'm just not feeling great," Amy said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Could I get the check?" The waitress tilted her head, her smile faltering for the first time. "You can't leave yet? You haven't finished." Amy's heart skipped a beat. She forced a nervous laugh. "I'm not that hungry after all. Just the check, please." The waitress didn't move. Behind her, the other patrons finally stirred, their heads turning toward Amy in perfect unison. Their faces were slack, their eyes empty. A chill ran down Amy's spine. She grabbed her purse and stood. "I'll leave cash on the table," she said, her voice trembling. As she turned toward the door, the lights in the diner flickered, casting the room in brief, strobe-like flashes. The patrons were now standing, their movements jerky and unnatural. The waitress blocked the door, her smile stretching wider than humanly possible, her teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered with an unnatural echo. "You're part of the meal now." Amy backed away, bumping into a table. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as the patrons closed in, their vacant eyes now glowing faintly. The walls of the diner seemed to warp, the paint peeling to reveal something dark and pulsing beneath. She grabbed a chair and swung it at the nearest figure, but it passed through them like smoke. Their forms twisted and contorted, becoming more shadow than flesh. The jukebox crackled, a distorted voice whispering unintelligible words that sent shivers down her spine. Desperate, Amy bolted for the kitchen, hoping to find another exit. The smell of decay hit her like a wall as she pushed through the swinging doors. The kitchen was a nightmare, a grotesque assembly of rotting meat and blood-stained walls. The grills sizzled with a dark, bubbling substance that oozed onto the floor. A sound behind her made her whirl around. The waitress was there, her body elongated and impossibly thin, her face splitting open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice reverberating. Amy grabbed a knife from the counter and swung wildly, but the blade passed through the waitress like air. The shadows closed in, their icy tendrils wrapping around her arms and legs. She screamed, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. The last thing she saw was the waitress's grotesque grin, her voice echoing in her mind. "Welcome to Maggie's. Stay forever." When the sun rose the next morning, the diner was gone, leaving behind an empty lot. Only Amy's car remained, its doors wide open, her belongings scattered across the front seat. The only sign of her presence was a faint, greasy handprint smeared across the driver's side window. The night was cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for sounds that weren't there. Brian pulled his truck into the gravel parking lot of Eddie's Diner, a place he'd passed dozens of times but never thought to stop. The flickering neon sign read "Open 24 hours," though it looked like it had seen better days. He'd been driving for hours, and hunger gnawed at his stomach like a feral animal. The diner was nearly empty, save for a man in a tattered jacket slouched in a corner booth. The air smelled of grease and something faintly sour. Behind the counter, a woman with deep-set eyes and an expression carved from stone greeted him with a nod. She wore a pale blue uniform, her name tag scratched beyond legibility. "Sit wherever you like," she said, her voice flat, almost mechanical. Brian chose a booth near the window, though the view was nothing but endless darkness. He picked up the menu and noticed the stains, reddish smears and oily fingerprints, as if it hadn't been cleaned in years. The options were simple: burgers, fries, sandwiches, and breakfast plates. He settled on a cheeseburger and coffee. The waitress returned with his coffee, the liquid blacker than night and steaming unnaturally. He took a tentative sip and winced. It was bitter, almost chemical. Before he could complain, she walked away, her footsteps silent on the tiled floor. The man in the corner booth hadn't moved. His head was bowed, his hands gripping a coffee mug that he never brought to his lips. Something about him made Brian uneasy, but he told himself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The waitress returned with his burger, setting it down with a thud. The plate was chipped, the edges darkened as if it had been through countless years of use. The burger itself looked fine, but the smell was off, too strong, too raw. Brian hesitated, his stomach twisting in protest, but hunger won. He took a bite. The meat was stringy and gristly, and a metallic tang filled his mouth. He gagged, spitting it back onto the plate. "What's wrong?" the waitress asked, suddenly at his side. Her voice was calm, but her eyes gleamed with something unsettling. "It's not cooked right," Brian said, pushing the plate away. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, it's fresh. Just the way we make it." Brian felt a chill creep down his spine. "I think I'll just pay for the coffee and head out." The waitress didn't move. She stood there, her smile widening unnaturally, as if her face were being stretched. "You haven't finished your meal." "I'm not hungry anymore," he said, standing. The man in the corner booth finally moved, his head lifted slowly, revealing a face that didn't seem right. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken and devoid of life. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he raised his hand, pointing at Brian with a trembling finger. Brian backed away, his heart pounding. "What the hell is this?" The lights in the diner flickered, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent lights turned into a low, guttural growl. The waitress stepped closer, her features twisting, her eyes blackening. Her teeth were jagged now, her mouth stretching wider and wider. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered with an otherworldly growl. "Not yet." The man in the corner booth stood, his movements jerky and unnatural. His mouth moved soundlessly, his head tilting at an impossible angle. The walls of the diner began to ripple, the tiles cracking to reveal dark, pulsing veins beneath. The stench of rot filled the air. Brian bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder into it, panic clawing at his chest. Behind him, the waitress's distorted laughter filled the room, joined by the guttural, inhuman growls of the other patrons. Patrons he hadn't noticed before, but now seemed to emerge from the shadows. "Stay," they whispered in unison, their voices melding into a chilling chorus. Brian grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window, but the glass didn't shatter. It rippled like water, the darkness outside seeming to press against it, alive and hungry. The figures closed in, their forms no longer human, their limbs elongating, their faces stretching into grotesque masks. With no other options, Brian dashed into the kitchen. The stench there was unbearable, rotting meat, burnt grease, and something sickly sweet. The stainless steel counters were smeared with black ichor, and the grills hissed with an unidentifiable substance that oozed and bubbled. He stumbled over something on the floor and looked down. It was a boot still attached to a severed, decayed leg. Brian gagged, his vision swimming as he scrambled back to his feet. He could hear them coming, their footsteps wet and heavy like something dragging itself through sludge. He spotted a back door and ran for it, praying it wasn't locked. His hands fumbled with the latch, slick with sweat, and finally it gave way. He burst outside into the rain, gasping for air. The lot was empty, his truck gone. Only the diner stood, its neon sign now flickering violently, the words changing before his eyes. "You're next." Brian didn't look back. He ran into the darkness, his breath ragged, the rain mingling with his tears. The diner's sign faded behind him, but its haunting glow remained burned into his mind. No one ever found Eddie's diner again. It disappeared with the storm, leaving only rumors of a cursed place where the hungry never leave. The diner sat on the edge of an empty stretch of highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. Holly's Diner glowed in pink and blue, casting eerie shadows across the cracked parking lot. Charlie pulled his car into one of the few spaces near the entrance, the growl of his engine the only sound for miles. His stomach growled louder. It had been hours since his last meal, and Holly's was the only sign of life for what felt like an eternity. Inside, the place was a throwback to the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a jukebox in the corner that played old rock tunes. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, the lighting too dim. A waitress with a stiff smile and a name tag that read Linda greeted him from behind the counter. "Take a seat wherever you'd like," she said, her voice high-pitched and unnervingly cheerful. Charlie slid into a booth by the window, though the view outside was nothing but pitch-black emptiness. The menu was already on the table, its edges curled and stained. He flipped through the options, noticing that every page had the same food listed: burgers, fries, shakes. No prices, just names. Linda appeared at his table suddenly, holding a notepad and pen. "Ready to order?" Yeah," Charlie said, startled. "I'll have a cheeseburger and fries, and a coffee." Linda's smile widened, too wide, and she scribbled something onto her pad. "Coming right up." As she walked away, Charlie noticed something strange. Her movements were stiff and jerky, almost robotic. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just his exhaustion playing tricks. The diner was mostly empty. A couple sat in a corner booth, their heads bowed as if they were praying, though no food sat before them. At the counter, an older man in a trucker hat stared straight ahead, his coffee untouched. Charlie felt the unease grow in his chest. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than it should, like a swarm of insects trapped in the ceiling. The jukebox crackled, playing an old Elvis tune that skipped repeatedly on the same word. Linda returned with his coffee, setting it down with a clink. Charlie noticed her hand tremble slightly as she placed the mug on the table. The coffee was a deep, inky black, its surface shimmering unnaturally. He hesitated but took a sip. It was bitter, almost sour, and left a strange aftertaste that he couldn't quite place. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but no food arrived. Food arrived. Charlie looked around, catching the eyes of the couple in the corner. Their gazes snapped to him in unison, their faces expressionless, their pupils unnaturally wide. "Where's my food?" Charlie muttered under his breath. He stood and approached the counter, where Linda was now standing completely still, staring blankly ahead. "Excuse me," he said. "Is my burger almost ready?" Linda turned her head toward him slowly, her smile still plastered on her face. "The kitchen is working on it. Please sit down." Her voice was wrong now, deeper, distorted, as though two voices were speaking at once. A cold sweat broke out on Charlie's neck. He backed away, his instincts screaming at him to leave. The older man at the counter suddenly spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should go." Charlie turned toward him. "What?" "You shouldn't have stopped here," the man said, not looking at him. "Nobody ever leaves." The lights flickered and the air in the diner seemed to grow heavier. The couple in the corner stood, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on strings. Linda's head tilted unnaturally to one side, her eyes wide and unblinking. Charlie bolted for the door, but when he reached it, it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, panic setting in as he heard the scrape of chairs behind him. Turning, he saw the couple and Linda walking toward him, their faces contorted into grotesque smiles. "You can't leave," Linda said, her voice now a guttural snarl. "You belong to the diner." The trucker at the counter stood, his face now devoid of features, just smooth, pale skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. He raised a hand, pointing at Charlie as the jukebox blared to life, the music warped and deafening. Charlie stumbled backward, tripping over a chair. The walls of the diner began to shift and ripple, the bright 1950s decor peeling away to reveal rotting wood and rusted metal. The air stank of decay, and the floor beneath him felt wet and sticky. Desperate, Charlie ran toward the kitchen, hoping for a back door. The kitchen was worse. The counters were smeared with blood, and the grills sizzled with unrecognizable charred remains. In the corner, a large meat grinder churned slowly, its contents oozing onto the floor. He spotted a back door and sprinted for it, but as he reached for the handle, a hand grabbed his wrist. He turned to see Linda, her face melting like wax, her eyes now hollow sockets. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice echoing inside his head. Summoning every ounce of strength, Charlie shoved her away and threw open the door. Outside, the night was unnaturally silent, the sky a deep, oppressive black. His car was gone, the parking lot now an endless stretch of nothingness. He ran anyway, his feet pounding against the gravel as the diner's flickering neon sign grew smaller behind him. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the sound, the low hum of the jukebox and the faint, echoing laughter of something inhuman. Charlie was never seen again, and Holly's Diner remains, waiting for its next customer, its sign glowing faintly in the eternal dark. The rain hammered against the windshield as Jen drove along the winding back roads, squinting to make out the faint yellow lines on the asphalt. She cursed herself for taking the shortcut. The GPS had warned it was a less traveled route, but she was desperate to make it home in time for her early shift. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Then, like a beacon in the night, a small diner appeared at the edge of the road. Its glowing neon sign read Sam's Diner, open all night. Relieved, she pulled into the empty gravel lot. The rain blurred the sign's red and blue glow, but the thought of hot coffee and food overrode any second thoughts she might have had. The diner was surprisingly well lit and clean, a classic setup with chrome stools and checkerboard floors. A man in a grease-stained apron stood behind the counter, his head bowed as he wiped it down. A single patron, a woman in her late 50s, sat at a booth near the back, staring at her coffee as though deep in thought. Jen walked in, the bell above the door jingling. The man at the counter looked up, his face breaking into a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome. Have a seat wherever you like," he said, his voice hearty and warm. Jen chose a booth near the window, though the view outside was just a sheet of rain and her own car in the lot. She looked around as she slid into her seat. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast and bleach. The jukebox in the corner hummed quietly but didn't play anything. The man approached her with a notepad in hand. His apron bore the name Sam in bold red letters. "What'll it be, miss?" "Just coffee and maybe a BLT, please," she said, handing him a weak smile. Sam nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. The woman in the back booth hadn't moved, her coffee untouched, her eyes unblinking. Jen caught herself staring and quickly looked down at her phone to check for messages. No service. The coffee arrived quickly. Jen took a sip and immediately regretted it. It was bitter, with a strange metallic aftertaste. She forced herself to swallow and decided to wait for the food. The diner seemed too quiet now, the kind of quiet that wasn't comforting. The woman in the back booth suddenly turned her head toward Jen, her movement unnaturally sharp. Their eyes met, and Jen felt her breath hitch. The woman's pupils were blown wide, the whites of her eyes bloodshot. She mouthed something, but no sound came out. Jen looked away, her heart thudding in her chest. Something about the woman felt off, her rigid posture, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table as though she were holding herself down. When Jen glanced back, the woman was gone. The booth was empty, the coffee cup sitting cold and untouched. "Here you go," Sam said, placing the BLT in front of her. She flinched, startled by how silently he'd approached. Thanks," Jen muttered. She glanced toward the back booth again, but Sam followed her gaze. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice too casual. "There was a woman sitting back there," Jen said slowly. "She left, I guess?" Sam smiled again, that too wide, insincere smile. "You must be imagining things. It's just you and me here." Jen forced a nervous laugh and picked up her sandwich. Her appetite had mostly fled, but she took a bite out of politeness. The bread was soggy, and the bacon tasted strange, almost sour. She grimaced and set it back down. "Not hungry?" Sam asked, still standing too close. "I guess I'm more tired than anything," she replied, avoiding his eyes. The lights flickered, and Jen felt a sudden chill. The air seemed heavier, thicker. The diner, once overly bright, now seemed dimmer, the corners darker. Sam's friendly demeanor seemed to shift as well. His smile lingered too long, and his eyes seemed to gleam with something she couldn't quite place. Bathroom's in the back if you need to freshen up, he said, gesturing toward a darkened hallway. Jen didn't need to use the bathroom, but she desperately wanted a moment to collect herself away from his unnerving presence. She nodded and stood, walking toward the hallway with tentative steps. The air grew colder as she moved, the shadows deeper. The bathroom door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly yellow glow. The mirror above the sink was cracked, and the faucet dripped incessantly. She splashed cold water on her face and gripped the sink, trying to steady her breathing. A faint noise made her freeze, a whisper, soft and indistinct, coming from the far corner of the room. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes scanning the room. The stall doors were closed, but the last one was slightly ajar. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. She backed toward the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. Just as she reached for the handle, the stall door creaked open. She caught a glimpse of something. A pale hand, unnaturally long fingers, and nails that gleamed like wet glass. Jen ran. She burst out of the bathroom and into the diner, but it wasn't the same. The walls were warped, the floorboards rotted. The jukebox now played distorted static, and the air smelled of decay. Sam stood behind the counter, his face stretched and distorted, his grin impossibly wide. "You can't leave now," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Jen turned toward the door, but it was gone, just a blank wall where it had been. The windows were black, not from the rain, but from something pressing against the glass, something alive. Shapes writhed and clawed at the panes, their movements jerky and frantic. She backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is this? What do you want?" Sam tilted his head, his neck cracking loudly. "We want you to stay. Forever." The figures outside the windows pressed harder, their faces, or what remained of them, coming into focus. They were the lost, trapped souls who had stopped at this diner before her. Their mouths opened in silent screams as they clawed at the glass, their eyes wide with endless horror. Jen turned and ran into the kitchen, hoping for an exit. But the kitchen was worse. The walls pulsed as though alive, and the counters were smeared with something black and viscous. Pots bubbled with unrecognizable substances, the stench making her gag. A back door loomed ahead, and she sprinted for it, throwing it open. Instead of leading outside, it opened into a vast, empty void. The diner stretched endlessly into the darkness, its walls melting into nothingness. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, cold and unyielding. She turned to see Sam, his face now a hollow mask, his eyes burning like embers. "You're one of us now," he said. The void swallowed her scream. The midnight fog clung to the ground like a shroud as Marcus pulled his truck into the parking lot of the roadside diner. He'd been driving for hours on a desolate highway, and the glowing sign that read, "Edna's Eats," was the first sign of civilization he'd seen in miles. His stomach growled as he killed the engine and stepped into the cold, damp air. The diner's neon light flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the cracked pavement. As Marcus pushed open the door, the bell above jingled, but the sound seemed muted, swallowed by the heavy atmosphere inside. The place was empty except for an old man seated at the counter, hunched over a steaming cup of coffee. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned as she wiped down a stack of plates. "Sit anywhere you like," she said without turning around. Marcus chose a booth near the window, but the fog outside was so thick that it reflected the diner's interior more than showing the world beyond. He opened a menu and frowned. The selection was sparse, eggs, burgers, and a mysterious item called the Special. The waitress finally approached, her expression blank but her smile tight, as though held in place by sheer will. Her name tag read Lila. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice soft and strained. "Just coffee and, what's in the special?" Marcus asked, setting the menu down. Her smile faltered for a moment, and her eyes darted toward the old man at the counter, who hadn't moved since Marcus walked in. "It's just a little bit of everything. It's what most folks order." He hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right, I'll try it." As she walked back to the kitchen, Marcus glanced around the diner. It felt old, not just in style, but in essence, like it hadn't seen renovation, or many customers, in decades. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, but its hands didn't seem to move. The jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, its lights flickering like dying fireflies. The old man at the counter shifted slightly, and Marcus noticed something odd. The man's reflection in the window didn't match his movements. While the real man stirred his coffee, his reflection sat perfectly still, staring back at Marcus with hollow eyes. Marcus blinked, his breath hitching. When he looked again, the reflection was normal, the old man's hand moving in sync with his own. He shook his head, chalking it up to exhaustion. Lila returned with a steaming plate of food. The aroma was rich and enticing, but something about the way she set it down felt hurried, almost desperate. She lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to say something, but then hurried back to the counter, her shoulders tense. The special looked normal enough, a burger with fries fried some kind of dark gravy on the side. Marcus picked up the burger and took a bite. It was delicious, the meat tender and seasoned perfectly. He swallowed quickly and went for another bite, but stopped when he noticed the gravy moving, bubbling faintly, as though it were alive. He set the burger down and pushed the plate away. "Hey, Lila," he called. She didn't respond. In fact, she wasn't behind the counter anymore. The old man had also vanished, leaving his coffee cup half full. The diner, now eerily silent, felt even more suffocating. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the clock. Marcus stood, his unease growing. "Hello? Lila? Anyone?" The kitchen door creaked open, swinging slightly on its hinges. From his angle, Marcus could see a faint red light glowing within. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, he stepped closer. The smell hit him first, coppery, metallic, and sickly sweet. As he pushed the door open, his stomach turned. The kitchen was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Meat hooks dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. On the counters were piles of raw, unidentifiable meat, glistening under the dim red light. The walls pulsed faintly, as if they were alive. And there, in the center of the room, stood Lila. She wasn't alone. Several figures surrounded her, their forms cloaked in shadow, their limbs too long and spindly to be human. They whispered in low, guttural tones that Marcus couldn't understand, but the sound clawed at his mind. Lila turned to him, her face a mask of sorrow. "I told you not to order the special," she whispered, her voice barely audible. One of the shadowy figures stepped closer, and Marcus stumbled back. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, a swirling black emptiness that seemed to draw him in. Its hands reached out, claws clicking together like chitin. Marcus bolted, slamming the kitchen door behind him. The diner wasn't the same anymore. The walls seemed to close in, the lights dimming until only the red glow from the kitchen spilled into the dining area. The windows were no longer fogged. They were gone entirely, replaced by solid walls that pulsed like the ones in the kitchen. He ran to where the door should have been, but it, too, was gone. The diner was a prison, twisting and reshaping itself to keep him trapped. He turned back and saw the figures emerging from the kitchen, their forms growing, stretching, filling the space like shadows come to life. "Please," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "I just wanted food." The old man's voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You were hungry, and now you'll feed." The shadows enveloped him, their whispers turning into guttural growls. Marcus screamed as they descended, his cries swallowed by the diner, leaving behind only the ticking clock and the faint hum of the jukebox. The next night, the neon sign outside Edna's Eats flickered to life again. A new car pulled into the lot, its driver unaware of what waited inside. The storm came out of nowhere, forcing Emma to pull her car into the first lit building she saw, a diner called the Hollow Plate. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie red glow over the deserted parking lot. Rain pounded the windshield as she hurried inside, grateful for the shelter. The place was nearly empty. A single man sat in a booth near the back, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and the waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee mug. The diner felt dated, like it had been frozen in the 1950s, but it was clean, and the warm scent of coffee and fried food was inviting. Emma sat at a booth near the door. The waitress, a tall woman with sharp features and hollow eyes, approached her with a smile that didn't quite reach her face. "Storm caught you, huh?" the waitress asked, her voice flat. Her name tag read Martha. "Yeah, came out of nowhere," Emma replied, glancing at the menu. "Just coffee for now? Thanks." Martha nodded and retreated to the counter. As Emma waited, she felt the man in the back booth watching her. When she glanced his way, he quickly looked down, pretending to sip from his cup. Something about him made her uneasy, but she told herself he was probably just a harmless local curious about a stranger. The coffee arrived, steaming and dark. Emma took a sip and immediately regretted it. It was bitter, almost metallic, with an aftertaste she couldn't place. She forced herself to smile at Martha, who lingered for a moment as if expecting her to say something. "Thanks," Emma said, setting the cup down. The waitress nodded, her smile tightening, and returned to her post behind the counter. Emma stared out the rain-streaked window, trying to shake the growing unease that prickled at the back of her neck. A low hum filled the diner, faint at first but growing louder. Emma glanced around, trying to locate the source, but neither the waitress nor the man in the booth seemed to notice. The sound was unnatural, a mix of static and whispers, and it made her skin crawl. "Excuse me," Emma called to Martha, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you hear that?" Martha tilted her head, listening for a moment, then shook her head. "Just the storm, sweetheart." But it wasn't the storm. Emma was sure of it. The hum grew louder, and now she could make out fragments of words, guttural, unintelligible, but spoken with a disturbing urgency. She looked back at the man in the booth, but he was gone. His cup sat on the table, still steaming. Emma's unease turned to dread. The hum became a chorus of voices surrounding her, pressing against her skull. She clutched her ears, but it didn't help. She turned to Martha, who was watching her with an expression that was almost pitying. "I need to leave," Emma said, standing abruptly. "Storm's too bad," Martha replied, her tone cold. "You're safer here." Emma didn't care. She rushed to the door and pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The rain outside seemed frozen in midair, the drops suspended like shards of glass. Panic set in as she banged on the door. "It's locked," Martha said, her voice calm but devoid of sympathy. "Once you're here, you don't leave, not until it's done." "What are you talking about?" Emma screamed, turning back to the waitress. Martha didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the booth where the man had been sitting. Emma's stomach turned as she saw what was there now. A shadowy figure sat in the booth, its form shifting and writhing like smoke trapped in a human shape. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and the diner began to change. The walls pulsed as if alive, the tiles on the floor cracking and oozing a thick, black liquid. The lights flickered and the air grew heavy, suffocating. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're part of the cycle now," Martha said, her voice distorted as though layered with other voices. "The hollow plate doesn't feed its guests. The guests feed it." Emma turned to run, but the black liquid from the floor surged upward, wrapping around her legs and pulling her down. She screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The shadowy figure rose from the booth, gliding toward her with inhuman grace. Its jagged mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. As the darkness consumed her, Emma's last thought was of the storm, the way it had seemed to guide her here. She realized too late that she hadn't stumbled into the diner by chance. It had called her, lured her in, just as it had countless others before her. When the storm passed, the hollow plate sat quiet and empty, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The parking lot was empty, and the rain-washed highway stretched into the distance. Inside, a fresh coffee cup sat steaming at the counter, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander in.